Have you ever noticed how Hollywood can make almost anything look glamorous? Even the slow erasure of a face people once knew by heart. Some of these women tried to hold on to an image. Some tried to outrun time. And some made choices that seemed harmless at first, only to watch those choices leave marks no spotlight could soften. In this video, we are not just looking at celebrity transformations. We are looking at what happens when fame, pressure, vanity, fear, and public obsession start pulling in the same direction, and the face in the mirror begins to change with them. And if you enjoy digging into the darker side of Hollywood, go ahead and subscribe. Now let's begin with someone who never hid the game, but may have revealed more about it than anyone expected. Dolly Parton once joked that it costs a lot of money to look this cheap. The line was funny, sharp, and completely in character, but it also said something darker about the world she survived in. Hollywood has always rewarded women for staying bright, polished, and somehow untouched by time. Dolly just happened to be one of the few who never pretended the performance was natural. Long before her face became part of the conversation, her image already was. The towering blonde hair, the rhinestone glamour, the dramatic lashes, the painted smile, all of it made her look larger than life. She did not enter the spotlight as an ordinary woman trying to look beautiful. She turned herself into an icon so stylized that every detail felt intentional. As the years passed, that intention became more visible in her face. The nose appeared more refined, the upper face more lifted, and the skin across her cheeks and forehead often looked unusually smooth and drawn tight. At certain angles, the eye area seemed stretched enough to make her expression feel slightly fixed, while the cheeks looked firmer and more sculpted than soft. Under studio lights, her face could appear almost lacquered, polished to the point where age seemed held back by force rather than hidden gently. Few women in entertainment ever looked so artificial and so fully in command of it at the same time. Dolly never seemed caught hiding the work or apologizing for it. She wore the illusion like part of the costume and somehow kept the public on her side. Even so, the deeper truth underneath her image is hard to miss. Behind the wit, the confidence, and the self-awareness was still the same pressure that follows so many women in fame, the need to keep adjusting the surface while time keeps pressing underneath. Some faces do not change all at once. They narrow slowly, tighten gradually, and one day the person people remembered seems to be standing just behind the version left in public view. Toya Jackson became one of those faces. When she first stepped into the spotlight on her own, she had a softer look than the one that would later define her public image. In the early years, her features felt lighter and more relaxed, with a gentler nose, fuller natural contours, and eyes that carried a warmer, less constructed expression. She stood apart even within the Jackson family because her appearance still felt distinctly her own. That began to shift over time. The nose appeared slimmer and sharper, the bridge more sculpted, the tip more refined, until it started to look almost too narrow for the rest of her face. Her cheeks seemed more carved out, then at times fuller in a way that looked less organic. The skin across the midface often appeared smoother and tighter, while the overall structure grew more rigid under stage lighting and flash photography. The most unsettling part was not simply that her face looked different. It was the way movement seemed to leave it in small degrees. Her eyes, once softer, could appear more fixed. The cheeks sometimes looked firm to the point of stiffness. In certain appearances, the face seemed so polished and controlled that expression had to fight its way through the surface. The result was not dramatic in one single moment. It was cumulative. Each change may have looked minor on its own, but together they created the impression of someone being steadily edited away. That slow transformation is what gave Toya Jackson's image such an eerie quality over the years. It did not feel like one decision. It felt like a long negotiation, with beauty, fame, and family legacy, carried out inch by inch across the face. By the end, the real mystery was no longer why she changed. It was how much of the woman people first recognized was still visible underneath it. There was a time when Rinna could walk into a room and people would notice the energy first. Later, they noticed the lips before anything else. In her younger years, Rinna had a naturally sharp and animated look that worked perfectly for television. Her features were lively, balanced, and easy to read on screen. Then came the decision that changed the way the public saw her for decades. At around 20 years old, she had silicone injected into her lips, chasing a fuller and more glamorous look at a time when exaggerated beauty could quickly become a signature. For a while, it did exactly that. Her mouth became instantly recognizable, bold enough to stand out, and memorable enough to define her image. But the same feature that brought attention also began to reshape the rest of her face in the public imagination. Years later, the result no longer looked playful. Her lips often appeared swollen, dense, and unusually stiff, with a fullness that seemed too heavy for the natural structure of her face. At certain angles, the shape looked uneven, almost overfilled, as though softness had been replaced by pressure. The more the look settled in, the less spontaneous her expression seemed. Then other changes began to build around it. Parts of the face looked smoother, tighter, and more maintained, until the overall impression felt less effortless than before. Roughly 25 years after those early silicone injections, she underwent corrective surgery in Beverly Hills to remove damaged tissue, a sign that the cost of one youthful decision had followed her far longer than expected. By then, the real problem was bigger than appearance alone. Rinna had become trapped inside a feature that once made her famous and later threatened to overshadow everything else. The lips were no longer just a trademark. They had become the evidence of how one cosmetic choice can slowly take over an entire identity. She used to look like sunlight in motion. Goldie Hawn had that rare kind of screen presence that felt effortless, bright eyes, a quick smile, and a face that seemed to react before the line was even finished. That easy warmth was part of what made her so recognizable for so long. Years later, the change was not hard to spot. The softness that once made her face feel so alive began to give way to something more controlled. Her cheeks often looked fuller and more lifted, as if volume had been placed too carefully to move naturally. The skin across her face appeared tighter, smoother, and more stretched than before, especially around the upper cheeks and eyes. At certain appearances, her eyes seemed wider, in a way that felt less open and more fixed, giving her an almost permanently surprised look. The familiar looseness in her expressions, the little shifts that once made her seem playful and spontaneous, no longer came through in the same way. Instead, the face looked more sculpted, more polished, and at times just slightly disconnected from the warmth people remembered. What made the transformation unsettling was not that it looked extreme in one dramatic moment. It was that her face seemed to lose motion by degrees. A little more fullness here, a little more tension there, and gradually the woman audiences associated with natural charm started to look preserved rather than present. On screen and at public events, that difference could feel strangely distracting. The features were still beautiful, still recognizable, but they no longer seemed to breathe the same way. What had once felt spontaneous now looked managed. Goldie Hawn's story carries a particular sadness because her original appeal was never built on perfection. It was built on spark, warmth, and expression. Once those qualities started competing with a tighter, more polished surface, the change became harder to ignore. In Hollywood, that may be one of the cruelest trade-offs of all. The effort to protect what made someone timeless can slowly erase the very thing people loved first. Television can make a face feel permanent. For years, Joan Van Ark had the kind of features audiences thought they knew by heart. Soft, elegant, expressive, and instantly tied to the world of Knots Landing. She did not need a dramatic look to hold attention. Her face already did that on its own. That is part of why the later change felt so jarring. As the years passed, the familiar balance in her features seemed to give way to something much tighter and more fragile. The eyes appeared more pulled and less relaxed, as if the delicate movement around them had been tightened past comfort. Her skin often looked unusually taut, especially across the cheeks and mouth, creating a stretched effect that made her expressions seem less fluid than before. The face people once associated with warmth and natural television beauty began to look sharper, firmer, and increasingly fixed. At certain public appearances, the smoothness did not read as youthful so much as overcorrected, with the upper face looking tense and the lower face carrying that unmistakable look of skin being held too tightly in place. What made Joan Van Ark's transformation so unsettling was how much it seemed to work against the qualities that first made her memorable. She was never a star built on harsh glamour or exaggeration. Her appeal came from softness, familiarity, and emotional readability. Once those qualities started fading behind a more altered surface, every change became easier to notice. The eyes no longer seemed to soften the face the way they once had. The mouth could appear tighter. The cheeks looked lifted in a way that added tension instead of lightness. Over time, the face no longer seemed to age naturally. It seemed to resist aging so visibly that the resistance became the first thing people saw. That may be the quiet tragedy at the center of her story. Joan Van Ark did not become unrecognizable because time passed. She became harder to recognize because the effort to fight time began to overpower the face that once made her so easy to love. Aristocratic faces are supposed to age into history. With the Duchess of Alba, age did something else. It stayed visible, but so did the struggle against it. Cayetana Fitz-James Stuart was never just another public figure. She carried one of the oldest names in European nobility, a woman surrounded by titles, legacy, wealth, and the kind of cultural status that should have made reinvention unnecessary. In earlier years, her face had a distinct old-world character to it, strong features, sharp presence, and the kind of natural eccentricity that felt inseparable from who she was. That changed over time. As the years passed, her face appeared increasingly tightened and reshaped, until the changes themselves became impossible to separate from her public image. The skin often looked drawn and unusually taut, especially across the cheeks and mouth, while the structure of her face seemed firmer and more rigid than age alone would explain. At certain moments, the features took on a waxy stillness, as if expression had been pressed beneath a polished surface and left there. By the time she appeared in later life, especially during the period when her marriage to a much younger man drew intense attention, the contrast had become striking. The face people saw no longer suggested quiet aging within privilege. It suggested repeated intervention. The cheeks could look swollen yet tight at the same time. The mouth area often seemed strained. The overall impression was not softness preserved, but identity recast into something more sculpted, more fixed, and far less human in motion. There was also the lingering suggestion of facial swelling beyond cosmetic work alone, which only added to the strange, mask-like effect her appearance could sometimes carry. That is what gives her story such a haunting quality. The Duchess of Alba had everything most people imagine would make aging easier: status, comfort, insulation from ordinary pressures. Yet even she seemed caught in the same battle, trying to hold the face still while time kept moving underneath it. In the end, the titles remained. The image did not. Some women spent years trying to become the face of an era. Linda Evangelista already was. That is what made her downfall feel less like a transformation and more like a rupture. At her peak, Linda did not look manufactured. She looked precise. Her face had structure without stiffness, elegance without obvious effort, and the kind of balance fashion rarely sees twice. She was one of those rare women whose features seemed to belong equally to the runway, the camera, and memory itself. Then came the procedure that changed the entire story. Hoping to refine her body without surgery, she underwent cool sculpting treatments between 2015 and 2016, a choice that sounded controlled, modern, and safe. Instead, the result moved in the opposite direction. Rather than shrinking fat cells, the treatment left parts of her body harder, enlarged, and visibly altered in ways she had never expected. She later underwent 2 corrective surgeries, but the damage was not fully undone. What followed felt even harsher, because it struck at the center of who she had been in public. Linda Evangelista did not simply look different. She disappeared from view for long stretches of time. For a woman whose image had once defined beauty at the highest level, losing control over her appearance carried a particular kind of cruelty. Even though the most severe changes were tied to her body, the emotional weight of it seemed to settle across her whole presence, including the face people remembered so clearly. In later appearances, the expression once associated with effortless confidence often looked heavier and more guarded, marked by the strain of someone living after a shock she never agreed to wear so publicly. The woman who had once seemed untouchable now carried the visible exhaustion of someone forced to survive damage in full view of the world. Linda Evangelista's story hits differently because it was not built on years of obvious excess. It came from a treatment sold as simple, modern, and low risk. That is what makes it so disturbing. One decision, meant to preserve control, ended up exposing how quickly the beauty industry can fail even the women it once placed on a pedestal. From Dolly Parton to Linda Evangelista, each story reveals a different side of the same obsession. Some turned themselves into carefully managed images. Some tried to hold on to youth. Others made one choice and ended up carrying the consequences far longer than expected. In Hollywood, beauty is rarely treated as something simple. It becomes pressure, performance, and sometimes even survival. Over time, the line between preserving a face and losing it can grow dangerously thin. These transformations were never only about appearance. They were also about fear, control, and the quiet cost of being watched for too long. In the end, the question is hard to ignore. When the face changes enough to protect the image, what is left of the person people once recognized? If you enjoyed this look into Hollywood's darker side, subscribe and stay with us for the next story.